Hey, this is Adam O, and we're going to start a brand new series today, which is the third part in a series that I'm doing called The Forgotten Midwest. We're going to be doing a little bit of skipping through most of the beginning of this because I'm compressing 6 hours of video down into as small of a video as I can. But it's still going to be a couple hours long. We'll get into that here in a minute and whys and all that. So I want to start out by dropping a really base layer of kind of a mid-tone charcoal with a Q-tip. And all I'm doing is I've scribbled extra soft charcoal onto scrap paper, and then I dirty that up with by rubbing the Q-tip in that and then just laying it on paper. And one of the reasons I'm fast forwarding through this part is my hand is directly over where I'm drawing. So you can't see it. Now, if I get to the point in Patreon and or YouTube where I'm making enough money, I will get a second camera and put that down at an angle so that you can see two different angles of me drawing this. And I apologize for that, but there's not much I could do to get around it. So let's break this down into some very basics because what I'm doing here is very basic. I laid a small, just the general shape of a tree down with Q-tip. And then I went back over that with extra soft charcoal and laid down just some horizontal lines to simulate bark, and then blended all that in with a blending stump. Now we'll get into more detailed versions of that you can actually see here in a little bit, which is one of the reasons I don't mind fast forwarding through that. The second step I'm going to do is, again, something very basic. I'm just going to get a dirty blending stump that's got lots of extra soft charcoal on it. And I'm going to start dotting in some random leaves here. And I'm not going to make these all the same exact shade and the same exact tone. I'm just going to kind of randomly dot these around, and there's no particular shape that I'm using. I'm just putting them in there just to have them in. And one of the reasons that I do that is because I tend to pull detail out as I go toward the corners of the drawing. The further I get away from the focal point, the less detail I put into the drawing. So the focal points in this are going to be the barn itself, that giant tuft of bushes that is hugging the side of the barn, and the tree trunk. And then as we move out from those, we're going to strip detail from the drawing. So step one here is, again, just getting in that trunk, getting it set in the most basic way possible. And then we're just going to start dotting some leaves using varying kind of random tones and shades. Because if you use the same pressure, the same tone, the same shade on every single leaf, it's going to look flat and unnatural. Now, if you happen to do that here in this section, that's fine. Don't panic. Go ahead and lay them in all the same shade, all the same tone, and we can modify those a little bit later. I'm just kind of getting a jump start on varying those tones just because I know more than you do how I want this drawing to look because it exists mostly in my head. When I say that, I obviously have a reference photo there, but I'm not trying to make a carbon copy or a photocopy of this reference photo. I want to get it as kind of as close as I can, but I'm not worried about matching leaf for leaf, branch for branch, or anything like that. I'm using it as a reference, and that's it. So that said, the first thing I'm going to do when I start doing the main branches of this tree is I want to grab extra soft charcoal, and I'm going to start lightly laying in the blackest parts of the shadows of the tree, which all appear on the left-hand side. And I'm using that as an outline and a basic guide for where I want this tree trunk to start and stop. Now, I'm not worried about making the shadows on this part super hard or super soft. I just want a black line there, and then we can soften those up as we modify the tree trunk. So what I mean by that is if I were to just draw a big black stripe here and then never modify it, it's just going to look like somebody went up to the tree and just painted a big black line there. And then it just stops, then a lighter part of the tree starts. So what I'm doing instead is I'm kind of breaking up that black shadow. You can see that I'm drawing here. It's got all these little holes and stuff that are in the line rather than it being solid. So I'm going to drop that in with extra soft charcoal, and then I'm going to blend that in with either a blending stump or a Q-tip. A blending stump makes more sense here. And if we lose all those holes, that's fine. But we at least want them to be there in the beginning to remind us that this is where bark is that's kind of breaking up that shadow and injecting just these little glints of light from these little raised bar sections. So I'm going to do that on most of these tree branches. There are a few of them that are not jet black that will, the ones that aren't jet black, will do the same exact thing we're doing here, except we'll switch to hard charcoal. But this is some extremely basic stuff right here. This is just, we're not going to get into a bunch of crazy detail. And in fact, here in a minute, we're going to fast forward a little bit through all this, because once you see me blasting through this first part, don't feel like you're being robbed of seeing detail in motion here, because nothing we're doing right now is detailed. We're dropping the branches in with extra soft charcoal and then blending it out with a blending stump. We're dropping in a bunch of leaves with just a dirty blending stump just to get them in place. And then when we get into the details, it's going to take some skill. We're going to slow down and look at those. And then once you get those right in your head, and you get the method for those and the technique for them, then we can start fast forwarding again. Now, I would love to just put, I think this drawing took about 17-ish hours. I lost some video in the middle of it, so I'm not sure. But I'm pretty sure that pencil to paper time was like 17 hours. So that's not counting things like breaks and all that stuff. When you start factoring in breaks and all that, then it was closer to about 30 hours. But so anyway, I would love to be able to do just that. The problem is we would be spending a month going through tutorial videos to show how to do this, and I want to break these into 2 parts so that we're doing a drawing every 2 weeks. So that's one of the reasons that we're compressing this from 6 parts in the first hour down to maybe 2. So what I'm doing up here is I'm not finishing off the branch with a pencil. I'm finishing it off with a blending stump. And all I do is I go into the area that I've already drawn with extra soft charcoal, that big thick black shadow. And I'm just lightly pulling across that whole area where I want that branch to exist. And that will fill in those areas with a mid-tone or a light gray and create the illusion that a branch exists. Now I'm going to do the same thing over here on the main part of the trunk of the tree, except I'm switching to a Q-tip because that allows me to lay in a larger area and allows me to lay in sort of this base tone that I want the background of the tree to be. So I don't mind if it's clumpy. Notice where we have some overlap here where the Q-tip has made these little darker marks that happen in waves. I don't mind that because the tree is going to have that anyway because of the way the bark is situated. So all I'm doing is I'm laying in this light or mid-tone gray with a Q-tip as a base. Then I'll go back with a really loaded up dirty blending stump, and I want to start putting in the most basic idea of vertical bark that lies along these areas. I'm just going little vertical strokes, dropping in some black. Sometimes I'll make them sort of V-shaped so it looks like kind of knot holes in the trees or where the bark gets a little bit irregular. If I did all these straight up and down, it's not going to look like bark. It's going to just look, I don't know, manufactured. So we want these to be a little squiggly and a little bit angled here and there and rough. So what we'll do is we'll drop those in with a blending stump and we'll start modifying the shadows by pushing that charcoal around. We'll use the blending stump to create the illusion of bark. And then we'll go back in with either extra soft charcoal or hard charcoal. Either one works. And we're going to start making more vertical marks to define that bark even more. So I think here I've got hard charcoal, but it doesn't really matter if it's hard or extra soft. It's just that hard is going to give you a lighter tone, and the extra soft is going to give you a much blacker tone. Yeah, that's hard charcoal. So all I'm doing is I'm making little thin, kind of light vertical marks here that kind of overlaps, and it's all squiggly. And those are going to represent the shadows that are thrown by each individual chunk of bark. And then once we get those in, if we decide that the tree's too light, it's not a big deal to just go over that with a Q-tip and blend it all together, and add a little bit of darkness to this. But right now, all we want is the basic idea of this trunk in the same way that we want the basic idea of the leaves. So occasionally I'll throw in just one piece of bark that sticks out a little further than the rest. Maybe it's got a little knot hole here and there. And we're just doing that with hard charcoal because we get a finer line and it's not as fuzzy. This tree likes to throw some really hard shadows because it's really rough bark. If we had a softer tree, something like a white birch or whatever, we could get away a little bit more with using blending stumps and Q-tips or whatever, because that bark is a little softer and it's not as rough and rolly as a tree like this. But with this one, the pencils just work a little bit better. So let's speed up through this, and it's the easiest technique. So we're not going to spend a ton of time on this. That's how you do it. We'll blast through it with some, fast forwarding, and then like I said, we'll start slowing down whenever we get to the more complex parts of this. Even though we're compressing this down into a way shorter video, it's still going to be like a 2-hour long video. So we're going to drop into the main base of this tree, and this is the part that starts to disappear underneath the bushes, that starts to get obscured by the bushes that are in front of it. And we're going to use the same exact technique here to grab extra soft charcoal and drop in that really black shadow that appears on the left-hand side of it. And then we'll repeat the process that we did for the top of the tree, where we blend that all out, and then we can start modifying chunks of bark, knot holes, and whatnot, using things like the blending stump to put a base layer in, then using either hard or extra soft charcoal to modify the bark. And every branch that has detail on this tree is all going to be done that same exact way. Now, I made a quick tip video that's only available to patrons, and it's the lowest level of patron, like the $4 a month thing. But I showed how to do a tree trunk in like 2 minutes. It's the most basic way that I do tree trunks. If you've seen that video, that's all you're doing here, except we're just taking a little bit more time to put a little bit more detail into it. Now, we're going to start dropping in some branches here, but we're not going to do all the branches. So what I'm doing is this branch on the top right, it's where the tree forks off, and it has 2 major huge branches that come off of there. I've done the 2 main shadows. There's one that runs down the middle of it to the like middle left. There's one that runs on the absolute left, and they stick out like a sore thumb. So I've dropped those in with extra soft charcoal, and then I'm going to go back in with a Q-tip and just lay in the base shade for the overall branch itself. We're not getting this exact. We're just dropping this in. We don't care if the edges are fuzzy or anything like that. We can always clean up those edges later and make them sharp. All I'm doing right now is saying, here's the basic shape that I want, and here's the basic tone that I want, and the basic shade of gray that I want. And we'll drop those in, and then we'll start sharpening up that and modifying it a little bit later. Now, the reason that I do this background layer first is because if I were to try to do all this by pencil, and I just start drawing in each little layer of bark, I'm going to have to draw the shadow of one little section of bark. Then I'm going to have to drop in the gradient and the reflection of light off that piece of bark, then move to the next one and repeat that process. If I do it this way and I just lay in the background, the lightest color of the base layer, and then I start drawing in the shadows on top of them, I cut out a ton of steps in that process. I don't have to draw a shadow here, a light glint there. I don't have to go back in with an eraser and start lightening up certain sections. I just drop in the background layer first, just like you're doing an oil painting, and then I put highlights and shadows over the top of that, and it's just a massive time saver. So now I'm going to switch to a blending stump, and we're going to do the same thing that we were doing with a Q-tip, except we're just doing it a little sharper by using a blending stump. I'm going to go up and down, and I'm just going to do that really roughly along this center section of the tree. And what that's going to do is naturally start putting in layers of bark, at least the first parts of those layers. And so I'm kind of tricking people into seeing bark where there is none. So instead of one big flat, tone of gray that covers that whole area, it's going to be sharper and it's going to catch more light in between the strokes. So then I'm going to grab a hard charcoal and do the same thing on this branch as I was doing on the branch to its left. I'm just going to start slapping in these vertical areas that represent bark. Oh, and apologies, this is one of the areas that I lost video. But all I did to get this is the same exact thing that I was just doing on that branch before the video skipped. All you do is lay in that background layer of gray. You go over that with darker charcoal to form the shadows of the bark. Then you can come back in with a Tombow eraser or just a really finely kneaded eraser and drop in a few highlights with that. And there you go, it's bark. It's really not complex. It's one of the simplest things to draw. So you can see me finishing that up here before we get down into that bush. And I'm going to pick a stopping point at the bottom of this because this is where it's going to get really, really complex. I'm just doing touch-ups on here, and then I'm going to stop because once I start doing those bushes that lie along the bottom of that, we're going to have to draw a lot of negative space, and we're going to be drawing around individual leaves there. So I'm going to leave that till later. Then I'm going to jump up in between the largest branch on the left, and then there's another medium-sized branch to its left, and it creates like an upside-down triangle of space. In this section, there's a tuft of lighter leaves where the sun is poking through a little bit more. So what I do is I grab we'll grab hard charcoal because we don't want this black. And very, very lightly, I'm going to start dropping in sporadic leaves here where the sun is kind of bleaching through those. And the tuft overall is lighter than, say, the tuft that's to the left of it. So I'm using a light touch here, and I'm just kind of slapping these in, and I'm making sure that instead of blobs like the ones on the far left, these have a little bit more of a point to them because we're going to start to see individual leaves a little bit better here. Then once we get those slapped in, I can go back in with a blending stump and just start pulling over the top of each one of these quickly, and you can see those starting to get a little bit darker. It also removes all of your pencil marks in this area. So instead of looking like it was drawn in, it'll be a lot smoother. It'll look like a printed out photo because there are no pencil marks that are real obvious. But the same thing here as the area that we worked on the left to begin with. We don't want all these leaves to be the same exact tone, the same exact shade. We want them to vary just a little bit so they look a little bit more natural. Because some leaves are going to catch light a little bit more. Some of them are going to catch shadow a little bit more. And so you want those to be at least varied in a subtle way. You don't have to have one that's jet black and one that's almost barely visible. So anyway, I'm going to quickly drop down into the little crook of this tree. I don't know what you'd call that, the crotch of that tree. And quickly just start adding in more clumps of leaves with basically like scribbles. I want to quickly add those in and then go back over the top of those with a blending stump to take out the pencil marks. And then we're going to repeat that process through this entire tree. We're only going to start getting detailed whenever we get down into where this big giant bush starts that's on the left-hand side of the barn or the tractor shed. So now we're just going to repeat. There's another branch that pops out. along this area, and this one's more in the background. It's not as in your face. It's kind of obscured by some leaves. So instead of drawing that in with hard or extra soft charcoal, I'm dropping just the basic idea of that in with a blending stump. And we're not going to put a ton of detail into that one because we're actually going to be covering that up with some leaves in a little while. But I do want it to at least exist so that it doesn't just look like there's so many leaves, it just totally obscures all the branches in the background. Those background branches are the things that are going to make this look three-dimensional. So anyway, my hand got in the way again there, but again, the technique is exactly the same. We drop that in, we finish it out. We're going to start to fill in the rest of this area with leaves. I'm going to do that with hard charcoal. I'm going to drop them in, and I'm going to kind of give each one of those their own little point, so they look at least a little bit more individualized and a little bit more detailed. Always remember when you're doing this that once you go over these leaves with a blending stump, it's always going to darn near double the value. So if I do a leaf as light as I can do it with hard charcoal, then I go over that again with a blending stump, that leaf and that hard charcoal section is going to just about double in value because all the little tiny pinholes that we left in that area with hard charcoal are going to fill in. And so it's going to naturally get darker because there's more charcoal touching the surface area of the paper. So anyway, here's where we're going to start thickening this up a little bit. I want to start picking out a couple leaves here and there, and I'm just going to add a little bit of definition to the edges of them, very lightly, just going over the edges of the leaf with hard charcoal. And the reason I'm doing that is because when you're using a blending stump the way I'm using it, it'll make the leaves look fuzzy. And since we're starting to get closer to a focal point, which is the nice, sharp, detailed trunk of the tree, the leaves also need to start matching that at least a little bit. So I'm just adding the tiniest bit of detail to each of these leaves so that they become more focused as we get to a more focal point. We're going to do that and finish out the rest of this area with leaves. And again, the reason this is starting to look a little bit more realistic than just smudging it on paper is because I'm varying the tones and I'm making sure certain tufts are dark, certain tufts are light, and giving the illusion that there is depth and dimension to these tufts of leaves. Now, even if I ran this video in real time, I still wouldn't spend a lot of time discussing this area because it's the same technique over and over and over again. If you want to do a drawing that's as detailed as what this one ends up, you have to be patient because this thing takes a very long time doing very, very tedious work. And the way that I get through it personally is that I listen to a podcast. The longer the better, because I can concentrate on what they're saying and the drawing becomes secondary. The tedious work becomes something I'm doing that's almost factory-like, because I don't need to put a lot of brain power into drawing tiny little circles or smudges or little tufts of leaves. That's not a brain power type of operation. So I put on a podcast and I listen to them talk and I get into their conversations, which is another reason, like, I don't really stream. There's two reasons I don't stream. One, I don't have a camera that's worth a crap, so I can't really, broadcast streams and have them look good. But the other is I'm also listening to things in the background in order to get me through these extremely tedious areas like this. So yeah, we're going to fill in these areas as best we can. The area that I'm in right now, the leaves are a little bit more broken up. There's a couple of tiny little sticks here and there, so I'm going to be a little less dense with the leaves in this area. Now watch whenever I grab this blending stump and start blending these together, they're going to darken. Whenever I'm doing random tufts of leaves like this, by the way, I don't go in with a blending stump and blend each one specifically. What I do is I blend it with a light touch and then I bounce that thing up and down on the paper. I lift up and I put down like several times a second so that it kind of randomly blends all those in. That way you're getting certain leaves that are blended and nice and fuzzy. You're getting certain leaves that come into focus a little bit better because they didn't get as blended. And it just gives a more random appearance to leaves. So let's jump forward. We're going to drop in some sticks and leaves and more and more leaves and sticks. But we're also getting to a point right here where there are a few tufts of leaves that have more definition than the rest. So right down through here, I want these leaves in this section to start to appear a little bit more than the ones that are above it. These are a little bit bigger. They have a little bit more of a leaf shape to them. So what I'm doing is I'm doing the same thing I was doing before, except instead of little squiggles, instead of little circles or ovals, I'm actually making these more of like a trapezoid shape that has points to the end of it and maybe even a little bit of a curve to each one of these leaves. And I'm doing that with a real light touch with hard charcoal. And then when we blend these in, we're going to be really careful to not destroy that shape. We're going to make sure that when we blend this, we're not making them fuzzy. We're staying within the shapes of those leaves. And this is really the first part of this drawing where we're going to get into some really tedious detail. It's not even close to the most detailed part of this drawing, but it's the first time when we're going to slow down, take our time with the leaves, and make sure they have a defined, definite shape. Now we'll go back in with a blending stump. Like I said, we're going to blend some of the ones that don't have as much detail together using that little bounce method I talked about. Then each of these leaves that have their own shape and their own definition, we're going to be way more careful with those and make sure that we don't destroy the shapes that we took all that time to create. When we get down into the bush, we will literally be drawing individual leaves for a very long time. We'll be shading around those leaves and using negative space in order to make them look detailed. These are background filler leaves that get more detailed and prettier and more impressive as they get closer to the center of the drawing. Now here's the irony about this part. So I'm going to take all that time and all that effort to make those look as individualized and standalone as I can. When I'm done with this drawing, likely nobody's going to see it because they're going to blend in with thousands of other leaves in this tree. There's going to be very few people who actually notice those leaves and go, oh my gosh, there's a lot of detail in that. So anyway, we will notice, and I think that true lovers of art would look at this drawing for a really long time and notice little details over the course of, if somebody bought it, they'd notice new details over the course of weeks and months, which is what, makes these things enjoyable to the people who do buy them. So up in this section, I'm going to blend out the rest of this trunk, and those little white spots that I've got in the middle are leaves that overlap that trunk, and also little sections of bark that catch more light than the rest of it. So what I'm doing is I'm filling around that area with a blending stump by just pulling charcoal into those areas. Then as I do that, the blending stump is going to get dirtier, which means that it's going to make blacker marks. So what I can do is utilize that by dropping in more leaves that have really dark shadows on them in that area. Then I can go back in with hard charcoal and start modifying those and sharpening up those details if I wish, which here I do. But we're utilizing negative space on that part of that branch so that when we go into having leaves that overlap that part of the branch, we don't have to erase those in. We can just, create those with negative space and then not have to worry about erasing details with a Tombow eraser. A lot of the times, a Tombow eraser is going to be much, much quicker to add lighter areas to a section, but there's other times where I'd rather have more control than that, and I'd rather do negative space, and this happens to be a negative space area. So here's another tip that I've got for areas like this. So I'm going to be adding more and more leaves, but there's also a couple of small branches that pop out, and they're kind of own entity and they're not clumpy. So what I'm going to do is whenever I start dropping in those individual leaves like that, I'm going to point them in different directions. So some of the ovals are going to be pointing straight up and down. Some of the ovals are going to be pointing horizontal, and a lot of them are going to be pointed at like 45-degree angles. So the more of those you have pointing in different directions, typically makes the tree look a little bit more chaotic and primal. So I want to pick out one little branch here, and I'm going to start laying in the leaves along the left-hand side of that branch, and they get smaller as they go toward the tip of that branch. Then I go on the right-hand side, and we'll do the same exact thing. And notice by the end of this looks like one little branch with leaves on either side of it that forms like a little upside-down triangle shape. You can throw those in all day long. I personally wouldn't. I would draw clumps of leaves first, and then just pick out a couple sections where you want those branches, those individualized type branches, to be their own entity. Those will become points of interest. Just pick out a few areas and drop those in, and it will be yet another one of those details that people notice further down the line. To be like, oh, I didn't notice that one little branch there. It's not just a big, crazy, chaotic clump of leaves, that you can actually see the branches coming out from the tree. Okay, so my hand's in the way here again, and I apologize. There's not much I can do about that right now. There will be further down the line. I've dropped in some leaves with a blending stump, and then I'm just going around each one of those leaves with hard charcoal, and you can do it with extra soft, and shading around them to close that in, to get rid of that white area so that it'll look like those leaves are placed over the top of that branch. And then we'll go back up into the area between the branches, between the main branch on the left and the main trunk. And we're going to start adding a couple of dark leaves in random areas to make yet another layer of darkness here. We want at least 3 layers of darkness. Dark leaves, mid-tone leaves, and extraordinarily light leaves. And that'll give the illusion that these leaves are on different planes and they have different depths within this tree. Now I'm just working on closing this area off a little bit. So if you look at the reference photo, I'm working on an area that's more like a mid-tone gray, and it gets much, much darker underneath here. And we'll get to that part in just a little bit. But it's also a little bit more closed off than the area that's above it. And so I'm wanting to make sure that I have it closed off enough to where it looks like big clumps of leaves, but there are also holes where the sun pokes through. And so the easiest way for me to do that is to start stacking leaves in this area and then just leaving those holes in random places. Now notice that the branch that I just drew in there a little bit ago now starts to blend away into that big clump. That's fine. Let those things disappear if they need to disappear. Again, the person who buys the drawing, or if you get it in a gallery or you do an art show, people will notice that further down the line. If you're just looking at the reference photo right now, you're not really going to be able to pick out many areas where those clumps exist. And so you don't want to make them exist and stick out like a sore thumb in all kinds of places. If you end up doing that, it's going to be a distraction from the focal point. The focal point here is the barn and those bushes and the tree that's to the left of it, mainly the trunk and the bush. The leaves right here are just basically a filler to tell people this is a tree. It's in the middle of the summer. So, all right, let's blast forward. We're going to start putting in a little bit more dark areas here, and I'm going to slow it back down because this area is an area where we're going to be using some negative space, and we're going to start to make these leaves a little bit more prominent. So I've drawn black areas around the edges of those leaves, and that's going to represent the shadow that's behind it, a much deeper layer of the bush. Then I'm going to go back up into the area beside the branch while I've got a really, really dirty Q-tip, or sorry, blending stump, and I'm going to start dropping in a little bit bigger, a little bit more defined, darker leaves in this area. These are catching a lot more shadow than the rest of the leaves that are on top. And I'm going to place these in an area that has flow. So notice that all of my stuff so far has been ovals that basically point down at an angle. So we're going to continue that pattern. We'll throw in a couple here and there that go more almost horizontal diagonal. When I say that, I mean that they're closer to horizontal than they are vertical, if that makes sense. But the overall idea is that they're going to mostly point up and down at an angle, and they're going to be darker than the rest, and we're picking out a bunch of leaves that are going to be kind of in the foreground and are going to be kind of feature leaves. These are the ones that are going to poke out and become more noticeable than the rest. So then once I have those, I can sharpen these up with hard charcoal by just kind of sharpening the edges of them and taking away that fuzz that the blending stump makes. I can also start filling in the background behind those with a nice dark, thick, almost black background, and that's going to make those leaves pop forward. So now that my hand's out of the way, you can see I've only got a handful of leaves there that have become kind of their own feature thing. And then we're going to fill in the areas around that with maybe a little bit less detail than what I've got here in order to make those pop forward. The same exact techniques that I used on all the other leaves, I'm using the same exact technique here. I'm just dropping in individual leaves, the idea of them, and then modifying them later. And we're just using a combination of a blending stump and hard charcoal in order to create these things. But there's no difference between what I'm doing here and what I did on the top left-hand part of this drawing when I first started. The only difference is that I'm putting a little bit more care into this part, and I'm putting a little bit more time into this part in order to make the leaves look more like individuals and less like just a part of the background. They will get more complex as we get into that bush. I'm going to keep saying that, by the way, because we are not even close to the most complex part of this drawing yet. Everything I'm showing you here is going to take some skill to do, but this is also part of the drawing that I think any even intermediate artist could pull off. The part that's going to take some real skill is whenever we start to do some just extraordinarily tedious work on those leaves that are the closest to the camera on the front of that bush. Now, before I scare you away, let's pop back over into this other branch, and we're going to just start kind of making marks here and there and throwing some leaves over the top of it. I'm not really even looking at the reference photo at this point. All I know is that I want some leaves to cover up that branch. So I just threw in a couple here and there, and then there's going to be some white spaces in between each of those leaves. I'm going to fill that in with hard charcoal, but I'm using some pretty deep pressure in order to make that a black, or at least close to black. And that way it's going to look like the spaces in between the leaves, you can see through them into and see the branch behind them, I guess is the way I should phrase that. Then I'm going to take away the pencil marks by grabbing a sharp blending stump and just lightly blending away the pencil marks. And then as we get further down in this drawing, that branch is going to, we're going to have to do less and less of this because the branch ends up being completely obscured by the bush in front of it. So we don't have to do this negative space type of stuff much longer. Now, another thing to note, as we get further in this drawing, my hand is going to cover the things I'm drawing a lot less. Because the stuff I'm going to be doing in a little bit, my hand is further to the right, and I'm also drawing at more of an angle, so you'll be able to see it like I'm doing here, where you can actually see the pencil tip, and you can see the drawing itself rather than it being obscured by my hand. And again, if my Patreon ever takes off and my YouTube ever takes off, one of the first things that I'm buying is a second camera so that I can show two different angles of these drawings, and you'll be able to see close-ups of what I'm doing, and it'll become way more obvious. But right now I can't afford stuff like that, so we'll see further down the line if this pans out or not. But so I want to start filling in this area with even more defined leaves. I'm going to, right now you can see me building another branch that has leaves that jut out on it, and then lightly I'm going to go back over each of these with the blending stump, and those leaves will just start to appear there because again you're taking out pinholes, which makes them appear darker. Now in between each of those, not each of them, but kind of sporadically, I'm going to have lighter leaves thrown in on top of that. So it's going to look like they catch light a little bit more. And the way I create those is the same exact way that I create the dark ones. I just use less pressure. So I want to blow through this area. Same exact technique to fill all this out. You're just using your eye to figure out what needs to be dark, what needs to be light, and cap this area off. And then I'm just going to go back into each of these and there's areas where you can tell where there's too much white and it looks like I've outlined the leaves in white. We're just taking some of that out so that it looks a little bit more natural. And this is just a little bit of refinement work that I'm doing here. You also have to keep in mind that as we go further down in this clump of leaves, it gets darker and darker. And so I'm kind of preparing myself to add that darkness in with hard charcoal, and eventually we'll switch to extra soft charcoal so that the further down into this clump we get, the blacker it gets and starts creating the illusion of some really deep embedded shadows there. So now I'm going to grab a Q-tip, and I've just got a little bit of extra soft charcoal on it. I don't have it extremely loaded up. You can see that there's a large clump of trees in the background, and this is one of the major areas that I'm going to change. I'm going to drop that in with a Q-tip with no detail whatsoever, just kind of short, small, stabbing motion circles, meaning I'm making them really quick, almost like you're drawing a check mark. So I want to smudge those circles in really quickly. And the biggest thing I'm doing here is I'm not going to make them even close to as dark as they are in the reference photo. For me, I want the barn and the tree to be as noticeable as possible. So this is one of the areas that I'm going to remove darkness in order to make the foreground pop out even more. It's going to also make it look like these trees in the background are much further away than they are. And it'll also make them look much bigger than they are. But it'll also make them look like they're catching more sunlight, and so they become washed out. I'll end up doing the same thing with the cornfield on the right. I want no detail put into that whatsoever. So now you can see as I start to add in these leaves using the same exact technique we used before, look how much more those pop out whenever I start overlaying those over the background. The background almost disappears entirely. But it's just enough there to break up that white paper. So we're going to use the same technique that I used. Remember when we did those individual branches that were sticking out on the right-hand side? We're going to do the same thing here, except these are going to be they're closer to dash marks than they are ovals, because the leaves we're seeing from the side, and then as we travel down that, the very top of it's going to have very small leaves, and then as we travel down that, the leaves are going to get bigger, and they're going to get a little bit darker. I think we're going to do two of these here. We're going to drop that one in, and then we're going to start kind of filling in with a little bit more leaves on this other section over here. Now the biggest thing to me here is having a light touch. So I'd rather have light leaves in there at first, and then if we need to darken them up later, we can. But remember, this is going to be one of the areas that's a point of interest. It's not a focal point, but it's going to be a point of interest because it's another bush that's not really connected to the tree, but it's growing up and has, it's separated from the background. It has more detail than the leaves that are around it. So I want to make sure I'm just a little bit careful here and I don't overdo it. So I'm doing, important leaves first. We'll lightly blend those out with a blending stump. We're looking for, I guess the best way to put it here is the biggest thing we're looking for is shape. You already know the technique because we've been doing it since the beginning of this. We've been going for 45 minutes now using the same exact technique. The reason that this little triangular or lance-like branch looks better is because I'm taking more time and having more variance in the leaf shapes and the tones and shades of the leaves, and I'm taking special care to make that a very specific shape. So the shape is what I'm worried about more than anything. Then as we get down toward the bottom of this, it's going to start to blend away into the big massive clump of bushy leaves that happen below it. But the stuff that sticks out, it's very important to me that the stuff that sticks out is its own thing. Now this boils down to like how I know to do that is a more of a feeling than anything else. You're going to need your own artistic eye to know where those things are going to exist and where they're not. So my personal artistic eye tells me that needs to be a specific shape. It needs to stick out more than the rest. And then as far as like the physical technique to make it, same thing we've been doing. So I'm just taking a blending stump here and I'm adding a tiny bit of detail to those background clumps of trees. And all I'm doing is just kind of randomly throwing in some squiggle marks that represent the most basic shadows that you can have on those background trees. And then while I'm in the area, I'm just adding a little bit of darkness to that so that it's more easily separated from the white background that's just plain paper. All that boils down to it was too light, I'm making it darker. So sometimes I over-explain things, and I apologize for that. So now I'm going to start defining the edges of this, and this is going to be the left side of this branch. We're pulling the leaves that cover it in the middle, we're pulling those out toward the left. We're going to continue that mass. So I'm a little bit careful here because you kind of need to see the edges of this branch, but you can't obviously just draw a line that goes all the way through it. That would be cutting off the leaves or in front. So we're actually drawing in between each leaf and deciding where those little dots need to be darker and where they need to be lighter. The darker dots that are sharper are going to represent the edges of that branch. It's kind of complex to explain, but I guess you're drawing in between each leaf and finishing off that branch in order to make it start to fade away and disappear into that giant clump of bush leaves. Now we have another section of leaves over here on the left that are also their own branches, but they're a little bit darker than the rest of them, and we're going to start to lose a little bit of detail in here because we're nearing the edges of the paper. I don't want to totally strip that out because, again, it's one of those areas that's closer to the camera than the area behind it, so I need to have some sort of detail in there. And I also need that point of interest. Not a focal point, but a point of interest, so that the left-hand side of this drawing isn't just boring. So I'm going to start to slap some leaves in here, and I may modify this a little bit in order to have some both dark and light leaves in this area. And I'm just going to start dropping those in and shaping those as I go. So the section here that I'm working on is, I've decided that I want some of these leaves to be a little bit more defined than the leaves around them. And this is something that I'd like to highly suggest that you consider whenever you're doing a drawing like this. I would rather not do 100% photocopy of the reference photo that I'm looking at. I would rather make some judgments and draw nature in ways that accentuates it. So this particular part, I could easily get away with just dropping in some dark, flat, extra soft charcoal and blend that out and make everything just kind of a silhouette. But I think it's more interesting if we put at least a clump of leaves in this area that stick out and catch more light than the rest. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm just kind of dropping in some leaves that have their own individualistic shape. They have a little bit of a dark background that's cast from the leaves that sit behind them. And I'm going to continue doing that in this area until I get a nice big clump of leaves that I'm happy with, that have, it doesn't become a focal point, it becomes a point of interest. And I know I mentioned that a lot, but I think that's really important because your focal points where your eyes are going to land on the drawing first. And those are going to be the most important parts of your drawing. But once somebody gets bored or gets, they're done ingesting that part of the drawing, their eyes are going to start bouncing around the rest of the drawing and picking out little details here and there. And I think it's important to throw them some details on the edges or the middle of the drawing that stick out and become like a thing that their eyes can latch onto and be like, oh wow, I didn't even know, like you took all the time to do this real detailed section over here, and it's almost hidden. It's like an Easter egg. So I like to throw those scattered around, from time to time. Now while I'm in this area, look between the left-hand dark branch and the main section of the trunk. There's that section in the middle that has all those leaves. And the thing that you need to notice here is I've got about 3 or 4 sections that are way darker than the rest. Those to me are what makes this look a little bit more natural and a little bit more almost chaotic rather than man-made and artificial. Those little dark sections, you don't want to go overboard with them, because if you put like dozens of those in this area, it's just going to look polka dotted and weird. But pick out a few sections to make darker than normal, and pick out a few sections to make the leaves more dense in areas than they are in others. And it's going to make the tree look more natural than what you would if you tried to just blast through this really quickly and draw at the speed of my fast forwards and just try to slap them in impatiently just to get them out of there. Taking your time in these tedious sections is really one of the things that can make this look beyond real. It's one of the things that will blow people's minds. So anyway, that's what we're going to do here. We're just filling out the rest of that quickly with some defined leaves. There's quite a few of them that are darker and some that are lighter, and I've got a lot of variance there. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you 2 techniques. I'm going to draw a vine that overlaps the tree. It's in front of these branches and it's in front of the trunk. So I'm going to draw the edge of this, which represents the shadow on the left, and get the shape correct first. And there's 2 problems with this. The first is the very center branch overlaps that vine and makes it look like that branch is in front of the vine, and it's not. I'm going to take care of that with one technique and then finish the vine with a second technique for the branch that lies below it. So our goal is to make the vine look like it's in front of all that. So I'm going to finish up this section with the shadow. Then I just take a Tombow eraser and erase away that part of that branch. And now just like that, it makes the vine pop forward and makes the branch sit behind it. So I'm just removing charcoal. Now on the branch that's below it, I don't have that problem. So what I do is I just draw the rest of the branch using hard charcoal, and I define the bark and everything and just get that totally finished, but I stop it exactly where the vine exists, and now it's going to make it look like the vine sits in front of that branch. 2 techniques that do the same exact thing. So once I get that in place, I want to take a blending stump with a sharp tip on it, or a semi-sharp tip, and all I do is I'm going to scrub that all the way down to the tree trunk itself, and that's going to put a natural gradient on this vine that's going to be darker on the left and lighter on the right, so that we don't have to be tedious in this. We don't have to go in with a pencil and purposely draw in a dark left-hand side and then fade out to a light right-hand side. The blending stump does all that for us. So whenever we get this laid in, all we have to do is clean up the edges of that vine with a Tombow eraser, and then we can erase straight into the tree trunk, and that's going to make it look like the vine lays over the top of that tree trunk closer to us. So you can see me cleaning up the edges here and just making it a little sharper. Then I'm going to drop down into that tree trunk, and I'm going to erase away part of the trunk and make that go right up into the vine. And just like that, the vine now sits in front of that tree trunk. And we'll just grab a blending stump to kind of even that out a little bit, and that's it. The vine exists. The irony is that vine will cease to exist, or at least become hidden, once we get all these other leaves put in, but that is yet another thing that whoever looks at this drawing is going to notice at some point, that vine exists, but you'll never notice it on first glance. Now there's another section of that vine that happens just above the bottom part that still goes over that tree, so we're just going to erase that in quickly just to make it exist. Then we can modify that. We can, grab a blending stump and lightly blend that in. Lifting charcoal is a really, really important step in making these definitions between light and dark, and creating depth and creating distance between several objects. One of my favorite ways to do it, though, lift it out, and then we can drop in the dark parts with the blending stump, make that connect with the rest of the vine, and then we can just clean up the edges with a Tombow eraser if it gets too fuzzy or whatever. So right here, I'm just going to go back over it and just clean up those little fuzzy edges, and all I'm doing is just light touch, finding where it's too fuzzy and erasing it away. And now we're just going to continue doing the branches with the same exact technique that we did in the very beginning. So I'm fast forwarding through all this because you know this technique by now. It's a simple technique. We drop it in lightly with hard or extra soft charcoal, depending on what level of depth you want, what level of darkness you want. Then blend it away with a blending stump, and then add in the bark with hard charcoal later. We're going to add in all those leaves using the same exact method as we used for all the other leaves. We're just dropping them in with a blending stump and dotting them in here and there. And then that's it. I mean, it's the same thing we're doing through most of this drawing. Now I'm going to slow it down here because we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to create a patch of leaves that have lost a ton of definition because they're being kind of washed out by the sun. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a blending stump and I'm using little kind of squiggle marks that are almost kind of like a figure eight. I just want to squiggle those in very lightly. And we can increase the darkness by increasing pressure in just certain areas to make it look kind of lumpy. But these represent a section of trees that are in the distance behind the barn, behind this main tree. It's just kind of set back a little bit. And so those leaves don't need detail. They just need to exist and show little clumps where they're reflecting shadow, they're reflecting light, and they're throwing shadows. But at no point here do we want these to be detailed. They just need to exist in order to break up the white paper and in order to push the detailed tree forward. So quickly we're going to drop that in. You can see where I've stopped it right along the roof of the tractor shed. Now grab a Tombow eraser and I'm just kind of sharpening up those little squiggle marks. They don't appear real well on camera, but they're there. Whenever we show the close-up of the finished product, you'll be able to see what I mean here. But I'm just sharpening those up just a little bit in order to give it kind of I don't know, a sharper shape. Now I'm going to pick out a couple places in the middle of this, and I'm going to add a little bit darker splotches. And those are going to kind of represent where the tree has dips in its branches. And that's the area where the shadows are a little bit more prominent. It will then take the areas that are lighter and push those forward like they're catching sunlight. But at no point here do we do individual leaves. At no point are we doing any sort of detail at all. We're not going to define any, leaves. We're just throwing that in there to have it in. Now we're going to go back into the main tree, the one that's up front, and we can start throwing in more leaves that are in the foreground. Now I'm starting by throwing some leaves that are, you can see how spread out these are. There's a reason I'm doing that. I'm kind of defining mentally a shape for this tuft of leaves, for this section of this branch. And so I started throwing in leaves that are just kind of like there just to give me a border to go by. There are also some leaves that may stick out a little further than the rest, and it kind of gives me an idea of how far I want to push this particular section of leaves out into this open space. So I put them there as kind of test leaves. And then mentally, it's kind of like a connect the dots drawing. I just kind of visualize, it helps me visualize the shape of this tuft. Now that I've got that shape kind of set in my head, now I can start filling that in with individual leaves, and we're going to start to make these look a little bit more defined than the leaves that are around them, because now we're starting to get closer to the roof of that tractor shed. The reason that's important is because since the tractor shed and the tree are focal points, the closer I get to the roof of that tractor shed, the more detail I want surrounding it. So I'm starting to define individual leaves in this area just to make them look, by comparison, this entire section of the drawing should look more detailed than the outside section of it. You'll really be able to see what I mean when we start doing the grass, because we're going to put virtually no detail into the grass at all. Now, if there's any section of this drawing that you're wanting, that you need to take your time on, this is it. This is the section where we're going to start to get really complex compared to what we've just done. The stuff that we've just done so far is about as basic as it gets. There's only like one or two sections further in this drawing that are even more basic than the leaves we just drew, and that's going to be the cornfield and the grass. We're going to put virtually no detail into either one of those things, but this section right here, I want these leaves to start popping out, and we're going to be drawing pretty much every leaf individually, and that's where it's going to get really, really tedious. And so here in a minute, we're probably going to speed up a little bit at some point here, but the reason it's tedious is because we need to have a direction for each of these leaves. And then once we draw a leaf, we also have to remember that there are leaves behind that are going a different direction. So you may have a leaf that's sticking straight up in the foreground, but the one behind it may be going at like a 45-degree angle in the other direction. So you have to kind of drop those in and then also think about the background, drop them in, and then using a blending stump, blend them together. At that point, that's the only difference between what we're doing here and what we did up above. We draw the leaves individually and then blend those out with the blending stump, but overall, the technique is basically the same. We're just taking more time and effort here. So we're going to speed up through this. We're using the same exact techniques to draw the branches, same exact techniques to draw the leaves, and we're just going to start filling this thing up and using our artistic eye to figure out which sections need to be darker, which sections need to be lighter, and that's it. It's same thing over and over and over again. The very first one of these that I did with intricate leaves like this took like 100 hours to do. This one took somewhere around 17. I think I've got 15 hours worth of video, and I think I lost 2 hours worth of video. Now, fortunately, the 2 hours that I lost were things that didn't much matter. It was like the base of the tree trunk, a little bit of that got lost. I think a little bit of the leaves may have gotten lost somewhere along the line, but the point is, when you first do this, if this ends up taking you 50, 60 hours, let it. Have the patience to see it through to the end, because those 50 hours you put into drawing this incredibly tedious section of stuff like this, the faster you're going to get at it, the more you're going to learn about it. And then when you do more and more of these, it will become muscle memory. It'll become just a reflex. And then you can do these much faster, much more realistic, and it's going to take less and less time. 15 hours to 17 hours as opposed to 100 hours is crazy. But I learned it by doing. So now that we're at the base of this tree, I'm basically drawing the tree itself, and then I'm leaving the leaves that are in front of it as negative space. There are some leaves and branches and stuff that stick out over the base of this tree trunk. So I'm drawing everything except those plants. That way I can finish the tree trunk itself, and then we can utilize the negative space that we're leaving behind to define the shapes of the plants that lie in front of it. And I know that sounds like a convoluted way to say we're drawing it and leaving negative space, but I don't know another way to explain it. We're basically leaving a white silhouette of plants that overlap the tree. Now, once we get this in place, we're almost done with this tree. The only thing that's left after we get this little section done is there's a bunch of leaves and stuff that happen over the top right-hand section, and those have virtually no detail left in them at all. So those things are going to be pretty quick to pop out. This is some of the most detailed stuff in the drawing, and then we'll go one step further on the detail whenever we get into the big giant leaves that you can see on the bush that hug the side of the barn or the tractor shed. Those are a little bit more complex too. But yeah, the reason this specific part is complex is because we're having to draw around plants in order to make the background tree look as realistic as possible, and to make these overlapping leaves look, better. So what I do is after I get those drawn in, I just go over the little leaves with a blending stump. Then I can grab a Tombow eraser and erase away little highlights that happen in those leaves to make them stick out and become sharper. From what you're looking at here, it almost looks like those things don't exist, but they'll become more prominent as we add shadow or light to each of those individual leaves there. And now you can see with a blending stump, I'm starting to pop in the very first of the overlapping leaves that overlap the big main tree trunk. I'm dropping those in with a blending stump first because it gives me an idea of where I want those leaves to be. Then I can grab hard charcoal and I can sharpen up the edges, and I can draw in the background shadows that lie behind those leaves. The decision on where to put those is going to be one of the defining sections that will either make this look real or artificial. My suggestion here is to be sparing with the background shadows that lie behind the leaves. Put just one here and there just to break up that little section. Otherwise, if you start putting in too many, it's going to look like you drew an outline over every single leaf, and it's going to look cartoonish. So you can see me kind of picking out here where I want to put those little dots of darkness, and where I want to break up the leaves with tiny little shadows here and there. Those all represent background shadows that lie behind each of these. While I've got my pencil in my hand, I'm going to jump over to this other section, and I'm going to start defining those shapes as well. I'm just going to start dropping in little thin line shadows here and there, and that's going to start bringing those leaves forward that cover the front of the tree, and it's going to start defining the shape of the top of that bush. This is really, really precise work. So whenever you start to add in these little thin line shadows and little triangles where the shadow pokes through the meeting of three leaves, like you'll have three leaves that overlap each other, there will be a little triangle of shadow in between those. Whenever you're doing this, make sure that you've got a fairly sharp point on your hard charcoal. And I don't use extra soft charcoal here because I can increase the pressure on hard charcoal and make those darker. If I end up using extra soft charcoal and I decide later that I want to darken these leaves up by just going over the whole thing with a Q-tip, if that's extra soft, it's going to smear everywhere. If it's hard charcoal, that's going to grip the paper more and is harder to move. So I can darken these leaves later if I want by going over it with a Q-tip, and I don't have to worry about smudging a whole bunch of extra soft charcoal. The hard charcoal tends to stay in place a lot better. So now you can see I'm just making little dashes. Sometimes I outline an actual leaf itself, but I do it very lightly just to kind of give me an idea of where those leaves are. Then I can build the shadows around that outline so that I don't have to erase them later. So I can put a shadow and butt it right up against the leaf, and you'll never know that outline existed. So now we're doing the tedious job of going in between these leaves. Now this is important to take your time on, because these leaves that overlap this tree are the most important leaves in the entire drawing. There's maybe one section that's equal to that, and that's the leaves that overlap the tractor shed itself. But these right here, you want to get exactly right because they need to be defined and separate from the tree itself. If they get too fuzzy and you don't get the shadows right, it's going to look like these leaves are a part of that tree, and they're not. And so we're taking our time to make sure they have sharp, defined edges. We're taking our time to make sure that the tree that's behind it has darker, sharper shadows. And those things will create a contrast and force the leaves that are in front of it to pop outward and force the tree to blend backward into the distance. That's why I'm taking some extreme care in this area to make sure that the shadows don't overlap from the tree to the leaves. They need to be separate. Now this part is just me being finicky. I'm I'm just kind of messing with the shadows that the bark is throwing off down in this section, and I'm putting a lot of vertical lines in this area. Now it's a way for me to also increase the darkness of the tree trunk itself without having to do a lot of blending. So every time I add one of those little lines that's the shadow of each individual little section of bark, it makes the tree trunk itself darker. It also gives a contrast so the direction of the tree bark is vertical. The direction of a lot of these leaves are in front of it are horizontal. So that gives you another contrast. The lines and the flow of the tree trunk end up going one direction, and the lines and the flow of the leaves go another. That contrast is really important in a piece like this because it gets rid of the tediousness of a drawing whenever you have direction that changes, especially with each layer of distance that you're working on. So that's one of the reasons that regardless of how these leaves look in the reference photo, I may actually change the directions of some of these leaves just to add a contrast between this bush and the tree trunk behind it. Now we're going to define these even further. We're going to go up into a little higher into the tree trunk, and we're going to start defining individual leaves here too. And these leaves are really, really important. So I'm making sure that they all have a very specific shape for each of these clusters of leaves and individual leaves. I want people to look at this and see that I took care whenever I'm making these. So rather than drawing an outline of the leaf and then trying to shade in each individual leaf and all that, I'm building them with negative space. I'm drawing the stuff that lies behind the leaves first, then leaving the white silhouette of the leaf. Then I'll come back into those later, and I can modify things like their individual shadows or any individual details I want to put in there. If I go too crazy with those right now, I could destroy that contrast between those clusters of plants and the plants behind them, and they could just fade away into the background. And I don't want that. These are important because this is where we're getting into focal points of the drawing. These leaves here are really, really important, and I want to make sure that I take my time and shape these out. I can't really give you a technique for this other than to use your eye and to start building these and taking your time. Don't go fast on these things, because if you try to just jam those things in there as quick as you can, it's just going to look like a mess. And they don't really need to look chaotic here. They need to look like individual plants that are growing up and kind of reclaiming this barn and covering the top of this tree. Because at one point there was a point where this tree, you could see the trunk all the way down to the ground. But this other tree has almost become invasive, this tree or bush or whatever it is, and it's starting to surround and swallow the area around it. So I want to make sure that that thing pops forward so that you can tell it's a separate entity from the tree. It's a separate entity from the barn. It's its own individual thing. The only way to do that, in my eyes and in my experience, is to take extreme care and make sure that that thing has a separate look than the things that are behind it. So that's why I'm going through here and using negative space to carve out those overlapping, leaves and branches and whatnot that poke up into this other area. Now, I'm not going to spend a massive amount of time in here. Most of the time that I spent doing this was just to carve that stuff out. Once I get down into the bush itself, I'm a little bit more relaxed because these are more chaotic. There's the individual leaves that I draw here are only going to be in the lighter areas. And the darker areas, the splotches behind those light leaves, can just be almost solid extra soft charcoal. They can be jet black with just a couple holes poking through. Now I'm going to grab the blending stump, and I'm just going to very, very lightly go through each one of these leaves and put more pressure at the base of the leaf and ease up my pressure at the tip of the leaves and just make a quick zipping motion. So it's almost like you're doing a check mark. You tend to put more pressure at the beginning of it than at the end, and it'll create a natural gradient. So just lightly press down on one side and then kind of zip along the shape of the leaf, and it'll naturally go from dark to light and make it look like each one of these leaves curves. And yes, I am doing this with every single leaf that exists here. All these are individuals. There's no shortcut to this part. If I was teaching this to a beginner, I would probably show them a way to just quickly slap those in just to get the idea of it and then move on. But I don't think this is what I'd call a beginner type of lesson. I think this is more of an intermediate to a possible master class on charcoal. So I want, if you're going to be doing this drawing and you're wanting to get it to look as cool as possible, I would suggest that you get used to the idea that you're going to be spending a lot of time doing very tedious things like drawing single leaves where they matter. You don't have to draw every single leaf that exists in this, but where they matter, you need to slow down and be okay with the idea that you're going to be doing extraordinarily tedious work like this. So now I'm going to continue doing the same thing as I did in that upper right section, except now I'm going to shift direction of some of these leaves and have them kind of pointing down and to the left. And I'm also shaping this big cluster. So I'm doing that with a tiny bit of a different technique. I'm using hard charcoal here because since this section is getting ready to overlap a very, very large section of jet black extra soft charcoal, I can actually draw in the outlines of a lot of these leaves, and then the background doesn't matter as much. The background is going to be the thing that breaks up and destroys the outlined look to the leaves. So the dark black that I'm going to be putting in here eventually is going to butt up against those outlines and mask it. Even knowing that, I'm still making sure that the outlines that I do put for each of these individual leaves, I'm making sure that those are not dark. I don't want to have big, thick, heavy outlines here, just in case I have to manipulate something. I don't want it to look cartoony. So every time I add another one of these leaves, I'm looking at the overall shape of this clump. Then whenever I get that shape the way that I want it, I can go back in with a blending stump and start adding those individual gradient type shadows lightly with that little zipping motion I talked about before. And now each of these leaves are going to exist on their own. They're their own one little, they're their own individual thing. You can see me using the little flicking motion there with the blending stump. If there's a shortcut to this, that would be it, I suppose. Just press hard on one leaf and flick, and you'll get the gradient you're looking for. Then you can kind of pick out leaves, hit and miss, that you want to be darker than the others, and just blend that in. Just straight up blend the whole leaf in with a blending stump, and it'll make that leaf set backward into the shadow and make the lighter leaves pop forward. So you'll just pick a few of those out and decide which ones you want to be darker or which ones you want to be lighter. This is another one of those areas where you have to trust your artistic eye in order to place these where you want them. Now I added in a really dark gradient here with hard charcoal, and then I'm going to blend that away with a blending stump. That just takes the leaf I was working on and pushes it back behind the other ones. It makes it look like the leaves that are on top of it are casting a darker shadow onto that specific leaf. It's one of the things that gives this depth and dimension. Now I'm going to break out the extra soft charcoal because I'm going to be working with some really dark areas here. And I'm going to start laying in some of these darker leaves and twigs and branches, and the part that I'm working on here is actually that big thick branch that goes along the left that comes out of the actual main tree. There's a section where you can see through those leaves and onto it. So I'm outlining the clump of leaves and leaving negative space where those leaves exist. Then the rest of that I'm just going to fill in with extra soft charcoal to finish out that branch, and so we have more, we can see a little bit more clearly where that branch is going to connect to the tree itself by doing this. It also creates the illusion that this bush isn't one big solid giant dense mass of leaves. you can see through it from time to time. It's creating clumps. I just do this roughly and then go back with a blending stump. We're going to blend all that in, leaving the areas where I just want leaves to overlap. I don't touch those at all, at least not yet. Now lightly, I can go over those leaves and they maintain their shape, but they're much darker than the leaves that are around them, so it looks like they're set backward. They're covered in shadow. If you don't use blending stumps, please get used to it. Because if you do this entire thing in pencil, it's going to look like it was drawn in pencil. I mean, the thing that makes my work often get the comments like, oh my God, I thought that was a photograph, is because I use blending stumps. I try to remove as many pencil marks as I can possibly remove. Just like that, that clump of leaves now looks like it has life and shape and layers. And I barely used a pencil on any of that. Now I'm going to go back up into this section and I'm going to start adding some more horizontal and vertical thin shadows. And we're going to start building more layers of leaves exactly the way that we just built them on this whole section down here. We're going to start refining, building leaves, building layers, little football type shapes of leaves that point in different directions. As an overall clump, they're going to basically point the same direction. But as individuals, they'll be tilted a little bit differently from one leaf to the next. So make sure you throw in some variance there. And in fact, I would even occasionally just throw in one leaf that decided to do its own thing and it points just straight up and down. It's just one rogue leaf that decided it was going to be, you know, it was going to be the rebel leaf. But it shows a little bit more kind of the chaos of nature, where everything does have a direction, but you're going to have a few things that decide to just be off kilter. So now we're building this clump. We're starting to completely cover this branch. And again, we're using the same exact method as we used to build these other tedious leaves. Football shapes. We're, getting a little bit darker whenever we're dealing with the background that lies behind those leaves. But you'll notice that the thing that I do here is I'm almost never concentrating on the actual leaf itself. In other words, I'm not drawing a leaf and then putting in the gradient and getting it the right shade and the right tone. I'm more concentrating on letting the background behind the leaf shape the leaf itself. So it's more like I'm drawing on that actual branch than I'm drawing on the leaf. Then once I get that in place, I can always go back in with a blending stump like I'm doing now, and I can modify the tone and the shade and all that with a blending stump. But I think it's easier, at least for me, to shape the leaves with negative space first, and then modify all the other details of the leaves once that's in place, because at that point you have the shape the way you want it. Shape to me is probably the most important thing in creating a realistic looking drawing. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Let's look at the top left-hand portion of this tree. When we just put in the most basic leaves possible with just a blending stump, if we did that over the course of this entire tree, it's going to look weird and slapped in. There's going to be no care put into that whatsoever. But as we travel through different sections of this tree, we use different methods and different styles to start sharpening the leaves a little bit more. As we get down to like the crotch of this tree where the branch meets the trunk, we're starting to get into individual leaves. And so the shapes of those things are starting to define the whole feel, the whole mood, and it's going to project detail. Even sometimes where detail doesn't really exist, we can trick people into thinking there's detail. In this particular part, we're varying up the level of detail in order to create points of interest in this. So in saying all that, the shape is the most important part to me in building this tree. The shapes of each of these individual leaves and whatnot. The shading itself can be modified all kinds of ways. We can darken it with, a Q-tip or a blending stump or a pencil itself. We can lighten it with a Tombow eraser or a kneaded eraser. But the shapes, if they're not there, is going to make everything look weird. There has to be variance in it from, this clump of leaf to that clump of leaves. And it's even important whenever we're talking about the size of the leaves. The bigger these leaves get as we travel down the tree, it gives the illusion that they're closer to the camera and that they're closer to the observer, and they become bigger and more detailed. Whereas whenever we go up into the tree toward the top, and especially the leaves that are in the far background, they lose size and they lose detail, which gives the illusion that they're further away from the viewer, which they would be. You're standing on the ground looking up and those leaves are 20 feet in the air. Whereas the ones that are closer to the ground are more eye level, and so they're naturally going to appear bigger. Their shapes are going to be more important. All right, we're finally going to get to the barn, just because I want to start laying this in there and have I want at least the roof done. Because to me, if I can't get the light correct on the top of this roof, it's not going to be worth it. I will have ruined the entire drawing and wasted all this time drawing this beautiful tree here. So the first thing I notice is that the very, very top of the roof is jet black. It's got a very, very dark shadow and a very dark shade / tone there. And so part of that is shadow. The other part is that it's a rock and tar roof, as far as I can tell. And they had those in sheets back in the day. So that gets really, really dark. And then there's a lot of these sections where you can see those little bursts of light that happen where the tree breaks up. But that dark spot on the top of it is pretty solid. It goes all the way down pretty much unbroken. Another thing that I noticed is it's not a perfectly straight line. This is an old barn. That material over time is warped and it has little rolls and stuff in it. So I do not want to make this a perfectly straight line. It's why I'm not using a straight edge here. I'm only doing this kind of by eyeball. I mean, I've done the outline before, but I don't use a straight edge, because if I do, it'll look too man-made and it'll look too perfect. I need those little subtle rolls to happen here to make this look organic. So I'm starting out by putting that really dark line, and I'm just being careful to make sure that I'm kind of trying to draw a straight line with my hand, just kind of almost freehand, without using a straight edge, because I know that since I'm not perfect, there are naturally going to be rolls in this line. So I'm letting my imperfection dictate the rolls and the little waves that happen real subtly in the top of this roof. So now I'm going to grab a blending stump and I'm going to start adding in the first layers of darkness along this and pulling this real dark kind of shadowed edge on the tip of the roof. I want to start pulling that down into the roof itself. One of the reasons I'm starting like this is, one, I want to get the background layer in place. But two, I'm kind of practicing my stroke to make sure that that stroke happens at a specific angle. Because everything that I draw here is going to be on a specific angle that goes from the tip of the roof to the side of the roof, and it all points down at like maybe a 45-degree-ish angle. So every shadow that I've got there, every piece of light, it all has to be pointing and flowing in that direction in order to create that illusion. So what I'm doing is I'm putting my toe in the water and testing my ability to draw and shade in that direction first with a blending stump, because in this little area, if I happen to mess up, no big deal, I can cover it up. If it happens in the middle of this roof, it's going to stick out like a sore thumb. So once I've gotten comfortable at drawing at this angle, then I'm going to go back up with my hard charcoal and I'm going to start dropping in little areas of shadow and leaving the areas of light in big swatches and big splotches. Because we can always refine those later. I'd rather have the light be big, giant splotches of light, then we can define their shape and their angle and all that a little bit later and tighten them up. But right now, it's just kind of giving me an idea of the direction they flow, of basically where they lie on the roof. Now there's another reason that I'm using hard charcoal here, and I'm kind of using it almost like a coloring book, where I'm going to just shade in this entire area with a pencil rather than what you normally see me do, which is normally I would grab a Q-tip here, right? I would shade all that in and at least get a base coat down. One of the reasons that I'm using a pencil here is because this is a rare case where I want the texture of the paper to dictate the texture of what I'm drawing. So this is a rock and tar roof. And if you look really close at the reference photo, you will see the not individual rocks, but you'll see the texture, the graininess of the rocks that happens on that roof. I can actually simulate that by lightly going over this entire roof with hard charcoal, and the texture of the paper itself will make it look like this section of the drawing has, rock and tar paper on it. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to blend it. We're definitely going to blend it after we're done. But this is the first step in kind of tricking the paper into giving us the texture we're going for, the roof-like texture we're going for. So we're going to do that with hard charcoal. We're also going to kind of keep an eye out on where the roof gets darker and where it gets lighter. So the roof itself gets darker along the top and along the very back the closer it gets to the tree. Then it lightens up as it comes toward the front. So we're going to keep that basic idea in mind while we're dropping this texture in here. Now the same thing whenever I start to do the edge of this roof, it's going to roll the same way that the top kind of has these subtle rolls and waves in it. Because again, over time, heat, temperature, weather, rain, snow, everything is going to kind of subtly warp that so it's not a straight line. In parts, it's become separated from the wood frame and it kind of bulges out in areas and kind of waves in others. It's not extreme. We don't want to put massive rolls in this and make it look ridiculous. But the subtle ones need to exist. So that's why I'm not using a straight edge and I'm just dropping this in by hand. And you'll see me, I start to do it here and then a little bit later I'll pull that all the way down to the end and I make sure that there's at least a little subtle roll through that entire outline. Now having that outline also gives me another kind of a landmark to remind myself that this is the angle in which you need to be bringing your pencil strokes. That's one of the reasons I added that there. Not just to tell me to stop, shading in the roof here. It's to remind me that there's an angle that I need to be shooting for, and this is it. This is the angle. Now lightly, very lightly, I'm going to go back over this entire thing with a blending stump, and I'm also going to do it quickly. I don't really need to spend a ton of time here. Now this is going to destroy a lot of that texture that we've added in, but we can always replace that texture later if we want. And also this is not destroying all of that texture. It's just fanning out a little bit of it. So it still does exist. It's much more noticeable in real life and much more noticeable whenever I show you the picture of the finished product at the end of this video. Now we're going to grab some hard charcoal and we're going to finish off the edge of this roof. Again, to make the border, to let me know where to stop. And the second thing is to make sure that I know that I'm carrying on the rest of my shading on this roof in the right direction, at the right angle. Now notice right through there I've put a little bit of a bow. It's barely noticeable. So we're going to keep doing that all the way down. There's also a little section here where the roof kind of lifts off of the wood slightly. And so I want to make sure that that shadow is kind of varied between the roof and the wood frame. What I mean by that is the shadow gets a little thicker in that section than it is in the rest of the roof. I don't want to lose that. If I try to make everything too uniform through here, it's going to look like a brand new barn that is perfectly measured out, and it's going to look like a computer simulation rather than what it actually is, which is an old, weathered, warped barn. Or tractor shed. I keep calling it a barn. I don't think it's a barn. I think it's a tractor shed. Now you can see me correcting right here the angle that the light was originally going. It was flowing in a way where the clumps of light made it look like they were almost going up and down because the angle was too obtuse. So I need to shallow that angle a little bit so you can see me purposely following along the same angle as the line I drew on the edge of the roof. I'm kind of drawing parallels there. So I'm drawing around each of these little light reflections and kind of manipulating those to be where I want them. But my strokes are done in parallel to the big line that I made on the edge of the roof to make sure that my strokes are going the right direction. Now that angle gets a little bit bigger as you get toward the back of the roof, but it's a subtle change, and it's one that I'm not going to spend a ton of time on. And that is just a matter of perspective. That's the basic perspective stuff they taught you in high school art classes. But overall, the angle that I want to be shading is the angle that I'm using right now, and just using that guide, the edge of the roof, as a guide to tell me to stay parallel to this and you'll be okay. All right, now we're going to grab a Q-tip and we're going over all of the roof lightly. I'm not going to press hard here. I'm just going to use a light touch and blend this out so that I take away a little bit of the graininess and have a little bit more solid shade that goes all the way across here. I didn't destroy the texture though. That's a big part of this. I need some of that texture to exist. Mainly I'm just filling in all the pinholes lightly. And now I'm going to go back up with hard charcoal again, and this is another layer of refinement. The roof of this barn is being done in a way that I don't normally do. So the way I would normally do it would be put in a base layer, modify it, darken it when it needs to be darkened, modify it later, and keep building layers and layers and coming back to it over and over and over. For this particular one, I want this to be about 99% done and ready to go. And so I'm going over this over and over again and modifying not only the texture of the roof, but the lightness, the darkness. I'm also going to be modifying the little splotches of light, and each time I make a pass on this, it's going to get closer and closer to being fully done before I move on to other things like the face of the barn and the big giant bush that's along the left-hand side. The reason that I want to do that is because if I don't get this roof correct and I can't figure out how to make it look the way it does in the reference photo and have that same feeling of light and dark and that heavy contrast and to make it look real, if I can't do that, this drawing is ruined. Because that roof, to me, is more important than even the face of the barn. The face of the barn is really important to everybody else. For me, the roof is the most interesting part. And so if I can't do that, and I can't make that look real, then I need to cut my ties and move on, or figure out how to make it look real. So this is why you're going to see me going over this, doing a little bit more blending, a little bit of erasing in areas, more blending, more pencil, until this thing looks exactly the way I want it to look. Then and only then do I move on to other pieces of the puzzle. And we're going to grab a Tombow eraser and we're going to start defining some of these light splotches. And we're going to also add in a few more here and there, depending on what I think makes a more interesting kind of splash of light on this area. So the harder we erase, the brighter those sections are going to be, and you really need to keep that in mind while you're doing this section. You don't want to get something that's so bright it looks like it glows, but you also need a really heavy contrast between the roof itself and the light that's bouncing off of it. So I'm picking a few areas and just putting some little dashes of light to make it look like the tree has got little sections, little holes that pop through where the sunlight can penetrate all the way down to the roof. Those little tiny, small, subtle ones, I think, are in ways more interesting than the giant splotches of light. So I'm just shaping and refining using a Tombow eraser. I'm not putting a lot of pressure on this though. I'm not really scrubbing those in. Now, whenever I want to modify the angle of these and kind of modify the way they fade on the edges or whatever, just grab a blending stump and start correcting the shapes and the edges, making some smaller, making some have less of a light, glowy white feel to them just by lightly going over them. But this is a part of the drawing where every shape counts to me. I think that I don't need to get this exactly the way it looks on the reference photo, but the shapes that do exist need to be pointed in a specific direction, and they need to have sort of some of them need to glow, some of them need to be faded, some of them need to be blurry on the edges, and so I'm really taking my time here to make sure that I get those right. Alright, so the roof is basically the way I want it now. I wouldn't even say basically, it's the way I want it now. So I'm going to go into the ridge and we're going to work on that area quickly that I talked about earlier, where there's a shadow that happens where the tar roof overlaps the wood frame. And so I'm just kind of darkening that up a little bit and then adding the little bit of imperfections. And then while I'm there, I kind of bounce back up into the roof and realize, all right, there's a couple places that need to be lightened. There's a couple places that need to have more texture. And so all this stuff that I'm getting ready to work on is refinement. Like taking that kneaded eraser, I'm just pressing and not really twisting, but pressing and rocking on it to lift up a little bit of charcoal to take away some of the charcoal and make that look a little bit lighter on the ends. And then I'm going to scrub in hard charcoal on the back side of that to make it a little bit darker, because even though I don't necessarily have to match exactly all the tones and gradients of this roof from the reference photo to the drawing, I do need to have the general idea that it's darker in the back and lighter in the front. So the kneaded eraser was just a quick, easy way for me to do that, lifting charcoal off and then adding more on the back side of that roof. Now I don't know if you noticed it here or not. So the light on that roof, over time, I have slowly changed the way the angle at which they lie. I've also shaved off little bits of that light each time I take a pass until they get the exact angle and thickness that I like. If you didn't notice that while I was drawing all this, go back at some point and put the video on like 10 times speed or whatever, and you'll see those little light blotches on the roof get smaller and slowly change their angle to be more in line with the edge of this roof. So now I'm getting into the actual wood frame part of the face of the barn. And this I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. I just want this to be a basic shade of gray. I don't care what shade it is, as long as it's different than the white paper. And I'm just going to throw that in really quick, and then we can always modify that later because it's one of the simplest things to throw in. Then I'm going to go underneath that with hard charcoal, or no, I'm sorry, extra soft charcoal here in just a bit, and drop in that shadow, and that will make that pop out. But first I'm going to grab hard charcoal, and I'm just defining these leaves that overlap the barn roof itself. And there's no reason for me to decide to do that right now. It's just I looked over at the roof, I saw that particular section was kind of bothering me, and I wanted to get something in there. So I'm just kind of quickly drawing in those leaves just to remind myself these things exist, you need to do them later. And it's more of a satisfying my OCD than anything to get those put in. Now if I want to add leaves that overlap here in places that I've already drawn, that's real easy to do. I just take a Tombow eraser and just erase those in right over just erase what I've already drawn on the roof of that tractor shed, and the leaves will just appear. Easy way to do it. I don't prefer to do it that way because I have a little less control over, the shade and the tone and all that of those leaves, but, it's a quick, easy way to do it. Then I can just modify the shadow that lies behind that cluster of leaves, and just lightly, I'm using circles basically, and a very light touch with hard charcoal to darken the shadow that falls onto that roof. And that'll make the leaves that I just erased in, that'll make those pop forward. So I can do this entire section without ever drawing an outline of a leaf. Now this is a much, much clearer version of what I was showing you earlier, or talking about earlier. I mentioned that there are little triangle shadows that appear behind leaves, and it's usually where leaves meet. There's like 2 or 3 leaves that will overlap each other, and you can see through them in that gap into the shadows that are behind them. So when that happens, you can just draw kind of a basic curved triangle, kind of a concave triangle, and you can fake the meeting of those three leaves. Right there where I'm blending, that's a concave triangle. So if you're ever wondering how to shape your leaves and you can't quite picture it, start drawing some concave triangles onto the paper and let that naturally build your cluster of leaves. You can build around that. So you don't have to picture every cluster of leaves and say, I want it to look like this. Now I'm going to draw this. Here I go. You can just start dropping down the shadows that appear behind them and then build around that idea, and the leaves will kind of create themselves. Also keep in mind that in this area, this is, again, if you've forgotten, this is the area where the individual leaves matter the most. At least until we get down into the bulk of the bush. But this area, these individual leaves really, really matter. So take your time with these and build these out. So once I build them out so far, if I ever have a problem like I'm losing motivation or it's getting too tedious, which will happen when you're doing stuff like this, move on to another area. So since I've already started building the roof of the barn and I'm starting to work on the framework, I just grab a B piece of graphite pencil and I start lightly doing the outline along the edge of this little piece of woodwork here, this little wood frame, just to give me a border to work on. Then I'm going to grab extra soft charcoal and I'm going to start dropping in the shadows that appear from the roof and go over the top of the barn face. So I'm going to quickly drop this in because there's nothing technical about what we're doing here. What I am going to slow down and show you, though, is that I've already got the outline of these boards in place, right? So whenever I'm doing the shadows that drop over the face of those, I'm not going to do one solid shadow that stops in a specific area. I'm going to do vertical shadows that stay inside the border lines of each one of those planks, each one of those boards. You'll see what I mean here. I got the first one laid in, now I'm laying in the second one, and I'm going to leave a little space in between those that are a little bit lighter because those boards curl and those boards will have defined borders that appear even with inside that shadow. So I'm going to do that with every single board that exists on this barn all the way up. Then I'll go back in here in a minute with a blending stump and blend all that stuff in. Whenever I blend it, though, I'm not going to use circles or horizontal motions. I'm going to blend by pulling straight down because we're going to be creating wood texture and wood grain. The easiest way to do that is to start from the very beginning when I'm first starting to put these shadows in, and I will grab that extra soft charcoal that already exists on the paper. I don't need to load up my blending stump, and I'm just going to grab that and I'm going to start pulling it straight down. I'm not worried about whether it's matching the reference photo or not right now because I can always fix that stuff later. But I know that that shadow exists. I know it goes down into the boards. I know we can see the edges of each of those boards. So that's all I'm trying to accomplish right now. We can refine it later. With that, let's cut this off and call this a video, call it a wrap. We will have part 2 of the video next week. I'll be compressing about 7 or 8 hours of video into one that's roughly about this size. If you know anybody who is into stuff like this, please consider passing along the Patreon. If you haven't liked or subscribed to the video, please do. I'm trying to make a career out of this, and those numbers matter hard. I can't do the career without the people hitting the stupid YouTube buttons. Anyway, I will see you on the next video, and thank you so much.